Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. Many regrets for our slightly tardy late, but thank you for sticking with us. I am delighted to welcome you all to this special edition of our Commander Series with General Stephen Lyons, Commander of Transcom. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. We're delighted to have you here, sir, for a discussion on Professionals Discuss Logistics. The Commander Series, which is generously supported by Saab, is the Atlantic Council's flagship speakers forum for senior military and defense leaders, providing a platform to discuss key strategic issues today. And we're delighted to be having today's event. Since 2009, this series has hosted top military and defense leaders to help shape the debate on America's role in the world. This is the 11th year of the series, and we're just delighted to have this as a benchmark of our work. We're going to be welcoming General Lyons to the stage, who will be joined by Oriana Pollock from Military.com, who is back with us to moderate this conversation. I also want to acknowledge the Atlantic Council board directors and members that are with us today. Here at the Council, we remain very involved in issues core to U.S. engagement and leadership in the world. And one of the key trends that our team is focused on is the impact of great power competition in the 21st century. In particular, at our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, which is hosting this, we're focused on developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges the United States faces with its allies. Great power competition is at the heart of this. So the title of this event alludes to a popular saying that amateurs discuss tactics, the professionals discuss logistics. Projecting power and assuring our allies, as well as deterring our rivals, requires the capacity to move forces around the world and the credibility to do so at a level of excellence. This has been core to deploy and sustain the joint force. Transcom relies on capabilities such as sea lift, aerial refueling that depend on aging fleets and future challenges and capacity. Moreover, while potential adversaries are improving their ability to contest both sea lanes of communication and U.S. air superiority, the United States must continue to project its ability to project and sustain the joint force. In an era of great power competition, logistics cannot be overlooked. We're delighted to have the 13th Commander of the United States Transportation Command, General Stephen Lyons, the first Army officer to hold that position. Before assuming this role in August 2018, General Lyons served as the 14th Deputy Commander of Transcom. His previous commands include the Army Combined Arms Support Command, the 8th Theater Sustainment Command, and he served abroad in Germany and an extensive experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. General, we look forward to hearing your insights. Moderating this conversation is Oriana Pollock, who's a reporter from Military.com. She's Military.com's air warfare reporter, covering everything from the latest personnel trends, aircraft, investigations, defense technology, to Air Force operations all over the world, and an active member of the Pentagon Press Association. So thank you for being with us today. Before I turn over the podium for General's remarks, I just want to remind everyone that we are, of course, on the record. I want to welcome all of those who are watching this online and encourage you to join the conversation using the handle AC Scowcroft and the hashtag AC Defense. With that, please join me in welcoming General Lyons to the stage.
Well, let me first sincerely apologize for my tardiness. It's pretty embarrassing when the Transcom commander can't get here on time. I understand that. But I did learn a long time ago that I never argue with aviation safety experts. And we had a little bit of weather come through. And you know, it's a small town airport in mid-America, and the one guy that you need to de-ice the wings is late this morning, and so even the 4-star didn't get out on time. So my apologies. But I'm happy to be here with you, and I really appreciate the Atlantic Council, and I appreciate the leadership of the Atlantic Council and what you represent and what you do as thought leaders, protecting our national security and advancing our national security interests. What I thought I'd do today, and I understand I'm really compressed on time, so I'm gonna try to yield back as much as I can to you and your questions. I've got about 5 or 6 slides. I'll kind of frame the discussion, if you would, but then I'll go really wherever you'd like me to go. So let me start just by framing where I think power projection and the role of U.S. Transcom fits with the national security strategy as described a couple minutes ago. And I always start just as a reminder that when the national defense strategy was published, you almost hear Secretary Mattis's voice behind it. And it reminds us that the number one mission of the department is to build a credible combat force to deter our adversaries, advance our national interests, but if necessary, if deterrence fails, to respond rapidly and decisively to win. And with 85% of the force structure in the continental United States, that's a key role for United States Transportation Command to project the joint force at our time and place of choosing. It also reintroduces really great power competition, calls out 5 particular problem sets, highlights the eroding international norms and long-standing international-based rules, and calls out specifically the need to be able to project and sustain the joint force under all-domain persistent attack. Now, that's a significant difference in the way we've approached things previously. So it has implications for what I would say the joint deployment and distribution enterprise. So if you go to the next slide, please. And I use this slide frequently to remind people of the purpose of the joint logistics enterprise. But I'm always reminded whenever I put this up here is, Admiral Ernest King in World War II, when he said, I don't know what the hell this logistics stuff is that Marshall's asking for, but I know I'd like some of it. And when you're in a situation where you may face, face great power competition, but you may face great power conflict, it changes the way in which you have to approach our role to project and sustain the joint force. So the character of logistics changes quite rapidly, as you can see across the top, from Stone Ages to gunpowder to initial mechanization and then the air-land sea battle to an environment today where we can project a bomber task force from the continental United States, go around the world, drop ordnance, and come all the way back to the continental United States without ever landing on a sovereign territory. That's a fundamental shift, and it's a fundamental shift in the way that we organize logistics, and it's a fundamental shift in the way that we have to integrate logistics into all other warfighting systems. And just as the character of war changes, the character of logistics changes with it, but the nature of logistics to project and sustain the joint force is enduring indefinitely. But you can see some of today's challenges that fundamentally shift the way we think about our ability to project power in terms of the level of increasing complexity, the diplomatic alignment that's required, and the increasing demands from a joint force that becomes higher and higher in technology. So the next slide, please, and I'll brush through these really quick. What I typically leave audiences with at this level is 3 key points, and I think you'd appreciate these given your line of interest. So our ability to project power, I think you would agree, is a strategic comparative advantage for the United States of America. There's no other nation in the world that can project forces and the level of lethality on the scale, on the global scale, that the United States of America can. And I think you might agree that as the security environment changes, our near-peer adversaries also understand a strategic comparative advantage. And we would expect our near-peer adversaries, as they think about our ability to project power, to look at ways in which they may be able to degrade or deny our ability to project power well before the first shot is fired. And then the third thing I typically leave audiences with is an understanding that there are linkages in this global mobility enterprise to commercial industry, both in terms of capacity, in terms of global trade routes, and other aspects of the commercial industry of which there's a level of reliance. That level of reliance is a strength. I believe it'll continue to be a strength, but it can at times also be a vulnerability if we don't understand how to use it, when to use it, and how to employ it. Next slide, please. Now, we're organized much like any other combatant command with an Army component, an Air Force component, and a maritime component. But I typically don't talk about the organizational structure in that kind of a construct. I think if you really want to understand joint power projection from a Department of Defense perspective, you look at these 3 elements, and I call them our warfighting framework. The first is an appreciation for our global posture. That global posture starts here in the homeland, in the domestic in all our power projection platforms, the highways for national defense, the railways for national defense that link to seaports and then allow us, and airports to allow us to project power overseas. And then in a very expansive network of allies and partners and like-minded partners that facilitate very important access, basing, and overflight that extend our logistics network to make us a strategic power, a global power, a superpower that we are today. And then in the middle, you would appreciate the conveyances that we use, and alluded to earlier: sea lift, airlift, aerial refuel, aerial evacuation, those kinds of functional activities that are required to actually move the physics of the force, whether that be an immediate force moving by air, or whether that be a decisive force closing by surface. And the key to this is a global combatant command, to be able to shift to global requirements, to be able to manage scarcity to the Secretary's strategic priorities, is a command and control network at echelon that allows us to shift to priorities at the time and place of need. And that together creates a global mobility enterprise that is renowned around the world to be able to project power. Next slide, please. So I mentioned to you briefly, you would expect, as an adversary looks at the strengths of the United States Department of Defense, they think about our strong network of allies and partners, they think about our ability to conduct globally integrated command and control operations, and they think about our ability, right, to project power on a global scale, among many other things, to include our great young leaders at echelon. But there you see a framework at which we look at our adversaries to assess how they look at the enterprise, whether it's in competition, whether it's in crisis, or whether it's in conflict. And that just gives you a sense for the range of activities that range from today all the way through potentially what would range in conflict. And I'll go to the next slide because I want to wrap it up to get to questions. What we see today in terms of what I would describe gray zone competition in the competition space that exists today, we see quite a bit of activity, as you read about as well, in terms of cyber reconnaissance, in terms of the level of theft, intellectual property theft that goes on, infiltration of acquisition value chains, foreign investment in global strategic choke points. I typically have a map. I don't have it with me today, but if you were to look at the Chinese investments on a global scale in every continent in the world, and you were to look at that investments relative to ports, you would see they also understand the value of that network, particularly as it relates to transportation and the ability to influence operations. And then you see adversaries coming after not just the operational end, but deep into the institution, into our business systems, to better understand our strengths and capabilities. And of course, you're well aware of the technology increases that lend to aerial denial and anti-access challenges. So today, we see adversaries at the high end looking at this enterprise, and we see adversaries that would very much like to be in a position to degrade or deny our ability to project power. And we spent a lot of time thinking about that. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I think that was my last slide, so I'll just stop it at that point because I want to wrap it up to leave the questions. But I have to say that for me, and I tell the Secretary this very frequently, you know, I have an enormous amount of authorities to operate on a global scale. The number of assigned forces in the global mobility enterprise are almost exclusively assigned to Transcom. It gives us a great level of flexibility as a global integrator to respond to the department's needs on a global scale. And concepts like dynamic force employment, to be strategically predictable but operationally unpredictable, are activities that occur every single day in the Transcom enterprise. And matter of fact, some would probably not have a full appreciation, even adversaries not have a full appreciation of how much activity exists in this mobility enterprise every day that allows us to kind of operate at scale, you know, until you start to spike. But anyway, I'm pleased to be here with you today, and I'll pause there and we'll stop, and we'll go to questions. And I thank you again for your patience, and I apologize for running a little behind schedule.
Hello all. Once again, I'm Oriana Pollock with military.com, and I think we'll just dive right into questions, as you said, sir. And I'm going to start with your last slide first. You mentioned gray zone conflict and competition. which is obviously when one side wishes to gain an advantage without necessarily provoking a conventional response. So, that sometimes incorporates how we message with our adversaries. As the leader of the command that leads the military's global transportation system, can you give us one recent example of how an adversary has tried to undermine mobility and logistics operations, and what did Transcom do to thwart that?
Yeah, I would say, Oriana, the biggest area that I look at, there's a number of areas, and I listed many of them there. But the area that I think is most consequential that we watch probably the closely is cyber and cyber infiltration. So some of these activities have actually been public and released, and others not. I won't discuss classified issues here. But we watch very, very closely where adversaries are coming, and really whether our adversary understands this enterprise in a way that could be consequential. And of course, what we're doing about that is we're buying down that risk in a number of ways. And there's no one way to do that. It ranges everything from enhanced cyber defense, which we've improved, to cyber hygiene, to investments in an IT architecture, cloud-based IT architecture, to a number of other activities to include our relationships with our interagency partners, improve relationships and information sharing with our commercial partners. There's a range of activities that are ongoing now to really to remediate that risk, to ensure that not whether, but when that would occur, that we would retain sufficient resiliency to continue to operate for the Secretary.
Does that call for reinforcements to your command and control, and can you give a few examples there?
Well, our relationship with Paul Nagasoni at Cybercom is very, very strong. As a matter of fact, he's piloting a trusted transaction initiative with Transcom. And there's a range of activities that we work on together. So we operate in what I would call a defensive space. Our linkage with him, he would have to create the active defensive measures to create conditions for us to be able to continue to operate, depending on what an adversary was attempting to do. And so our relationship is very strong in that regard.
I'm going to, as the air warfare reporter, I'm going to start with an air component first.
Sure.
With some of the linkages that you mentioned earlier, you leverage an abundance of contracts with agencies and companies to do your job, and that includes auxiliary, Civil Reserve Air Fleet and things like that. And that's really about providing additional access. But the commercial transportation industry has really changed dynamically over the last few years. And as carriers and providers either consolidate or go out of business, what is Transcom watching out for in this space as this industry changes?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would characterize the the airline industry, for example, is growing and pretty strong, and we see a lot of growth. But we also see very good subscription to the Civil Reserve Aviation Fleet, and so the aviation carriers are committed to that program. We use them commercial augmentation on a regular basis, and then we retain the ability to surge that capability under those, under that emergency preparedness program. In the sea lift industry, that's a more challenging industry in global competition. So we actively advocate and work with the industry partners and with Congress to ensure that we have a military maritime security program that offers a stipend to retain capacity in the maritime security program. And we have a good partnership with the industry at the moment. And I think they're pretty stable, but that's an area we have to watch a little bit more closely to ensure we can retain a U.S. flag capability for the United States of America.
Would you be open to giving more, leverage to commercial airlines? I mean, one innovator in this space of late has been Amazon, of course, and they're building up their freighter fleet to compete with FedEx and other transportation services. I mean, what can the military learn from these companies, in this space and as they compete and advance with one another? I mean, is there a possibility that, the airlift fleet these commercial airline fleets could one day go into war zones? I mean, what kind of reach do you want to give them?
Yeah, the how we employ the commercial carriers obviously depends on the security environment, and we all acknowledge that. And so we would have to work very, very hard to create the conditions, a permissive condition to operate those carriers. And we acknowledge that. And in an area that we were unable to present those conditions, obviously we'd operate from transload locations that would not be as efficient until we could gain the level of superiority to create a permissive environment.
And that's really just to see how, I mean, you really want to work on how quickly you can get things to the deployed soldiers in need of this equipment. I mean, how is that changing in this space, though, as we talk about this, you know, as industry is really evolving?
Yeah, well, what's core and enduring, I think, to remember is, you know, regardless of the conditions, our task is to project and sustain the force. And so if it's an immediate force, we're largely talking about an airlift. So if you look back a couple weeks in the airlift of the brigade out of the 82nd Airborne Division, be able to close that brigade relatively rapidly. If you're looking at a decisive force, you need a surface capability. And so we have an organic capability on top of, in addition to, we have commercial capabilities. So it's a bit of a combination of capabilities that we count on. So I guess my point is we want to retain, even in our commercial base, sufficient resiliency where we're not, we don't have a single point of failure in a particular capacity or a particular carrier, if that makes sense.
I think with the comments you made on the national defense strategy, it's really forcing a lot of officials to think in a different way.
It is.
You've heard from, you know, Air Mobility Command, which you partner with a lot, on, you know, how to move forces and potentially, you know, thwart adversaries by changing minor details or plans or things like this. But is it possible with, you know, an increase in budgets, potentially a decrease in budgets, depending on what happens in the next fiscal year, do you think you could shrink your footprint while expanding your reach?
No, that's a great question, right? So there's going to be some natural tension there. In order to have the global reach that you need, you have to have a global footprint. That's key. That's kind of foundational to our ability to project the force. So our, you know, our bases and so forth, our access points, our operating nodes, if you would, across the globe are critical. And what you would never want to do is shrink those to a point where you had a single point of failure or lack the sufficient resiliency to operate at our timing and tempo, not at the adversaries. So you can shrink forces to a degree, but you must maintain a foundational element that allows you to respond rapidly to the point that you're making.
How do those plans come to fruition? I mean, this reminds me of, you know, base in a box, which, you know, the Army and the Air Force are working on together to put smaller footprints, you know, just building tents in areas closer in Eastern Europe. I mean, how do those plans come to fruition again, and, you know, how do those decisions get made?
Well, for the, you know, for the higher end global integrated plans, there's a force flow attached to it. That force flow has a logistic signature. And there's, you know, you can develop, in the time phasing of a force movement, you can develop the lift that's required for that. And so that's the way the force sizing and sufficiency is built for the global mobility enterprise. And if you want to take other concepts like the ability to move rapidly, adjust, open, close bases, et cetera, those are all viable concepts. And then what we would have to do is take a look at so you move from a concept to force design. There's a bill required to invest in your ability to do that. Now, to a degree, you can do that today. So what Transcom has today, for example, in the air component, are you know, contingency response wings. So when Joe McKenzie said, "I'd like to reopen Prince Sultan Air Base," you know, it was the contingency response wing that went in there initially within really hours or a couple of days to open that thing up. So we have the ability to do that today. The question would be on scale. You know, what would we need to do that on a scale that would be different than today?
You mentioned earlier, you know, there's the way you weigh, you know, airlift or, you know, doing operations by land, but you mentioned, you know, you look at things differently with maritime control and the challenges there. And I know last year that Transportation Command ran its largest Ready Reserve Fleet stress test since 2003, basically testing how ready sea lift capability is at a moment's notice. What did you learn from this exercise, and do you think that the Navy's strategy for recapitalizing the surge sea lift is serious enough?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, you're referring to the turbo activation that we conducted, and we activated 33 ships on no notice. And by the way, I'll just tell you that activation exercise came out of that followed a briefing to the Secretary of Defense on sea lift, of which SecNav was sitting next to me and said, you know what, we need to stress this, and you know, we didn't have the full complement of money to do it, and he actually came in with the rest of the money to do it. And so I really, you know, Secretary Spencer at the time, I really stepped forward on this. Now what we learned is we kind of confirmed what we knew, in that the readiness of the fleet today is not where it needs to be. And the Navy acknowledges that, we acknowledge that. We've been on the Hill acknowledges that. Appropriate level committees. Congress has granted us the authority, granted the Navy authority to purchase 7 used ships off the open market. So we've got a couple issues. You know, one is the age of the fleet right now is pressing 50 or more years, and it's very difficult to conduct service life extensions on a ship that's that old. So, and what we're finding is the money that's programmed against it is woefully insufficient to come back out of the shipyard in a ready status. And so what we want to do is reduce the age of the fleet, improve reliability. We'd like to take a kind of over the years approach to this, so we're consistently reinvesting. I actually think that probably the best approach is the acquired use strategy. We need to demonstrate to Congress that we can do this successfully. I think the new buy concept, the rest of that, you know, 3-prong effort that the Navy had laid out in the Sea Lift the Nation Needs report, you know, one was service life extension, one was used by, and the third was to build the new vessels. I think the Navy's going to be hard pressed to afford a $850 million new vessel that's going to sit in reduced operating status, given their other bills. And I've actually talked to the Navy about this. I think there's a win-win in here with the acquired use strategy, provided we continue to get the Congress support.
With so many of these components under your hat, and then the fiscal 2021 budget being put together right now, I mean, as you get called to the Hill potentially in the next couple weeks or months, I mean, what is the one thing that you will be advocating for that Congress really needs to understand from a Transcom perspective? Yeah,
well, you know, if you were asking me what my top 2 readiness concerns would be, one of them is clearly sea lift, and we've got to do something about the sea lift problem. The Secretary understands this. This is the one topic I've talked to him on probably more than any other. The second I would tell you is we got to figure out a way to mitigate the delayed fielding of the KC-46. And because that delay is built in, and because we had already planned, the Air Force had already planned on the retirement of some number of KC-135s and KC-10s, if we're not careful, we're going to see a real dip, a bathtub in taskable tails for the Joint Force. And so that's the other issue that's very, very high on my radar that we're working with the Air Force, to retain a capability so that we have continuous coverage of the Joint Force while we work through the issues we've got to work through in the KC-46.
The Pentagon has weighed on the tanker side, potentially doing a tanker leasing program, which works with defense industry to, you know, fill that gap as KC-46 comes online, or any other tanker in the future. What are your thoughts on potentially utilizing that auxiliary capability from defense industry?
Yeah, I think it's worth a look. I mean, I think there's a lot of capability that gets used, whether it's supporting CONUS training or other activities, and I think there's opportunities to reduce the tension or stress on that particular force element. So across Transcom, the area refueling force element is the most stressed, and probably the one that's pushing the red line or exceeding the red line in the Secretary's deploy to dwell or mob to dwell targets. So that's an area I think it's worth taking a look, and we are taking a look at that actually, but I haven't seen the business case on that yet.
What are some immediate pros and cons that come to mind with using something that tanker leasing?
Well, one of the immediate pros obviously is to take the pressure off the force. There will be limits on how you can employ, just like we talked about with the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. You certainly wouldn't be able to employ that capability in a contested environment or combat environment. But nonetheless, if you had a bit of a hybrid and you had an outlet, much like we do on airlift, it could take a little bit of pressure off the force.
Before I go to my last question, we will take audience questions very soon. If you were to, you know, scale this from 1 to 10, would you say that the military lift capacity for the entire military is adequately sized for great power competition?
Well, it's it's a great question. It's not a yes or no question, as you know, because it depends on the force element. So I would say in the airlift category, I would say our sizing is accurate and a great power competition against our analysis for global ready base plans, assuming that we have access to capacity and reserve component and commercial capacity. In the area refueling area, we're behind. That's the importance of the KC-46 and also the ability to retain some number of legacy tails. And then in other areas, we're actually in reasonable, I think we're at, moderate risk is what I would say. So whether that be patient evacuation or I think all of our CONUS-based readiness and preparedness programs, highways, railways, seaports, those kinds of things are in pretty good shape with the exception of one outlier. But so, and we've got a very methodical analytic approach to this where we kind of dissect the requirements against a high-end conflict scenario, and then we work back through what are those readiness implications and what are the force sizing shortfalls.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. My questions have concluded, but I am going to start taking some from audience members. I'll go to Travis Tritton in the front row here.
Is there a microphone?
Yep, no, there's one right there.
Travis Tritton, Bloomberg Government. Sir, I'd like to ask you about the household goods contract.
Yeah.
First, I believe that you were asked to supply a business case analysis and brief that to folks on the Hill. What's the status there? And secondly, at this point, what's your estimated date for actually awarding the contract?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. We're doing a lot of work in that area. When I took command, it was probably the, it was the one area where I got more love letters from Congress than any other, a whole desk drawer full of them. So we have decided to restructure our relationship with industry, and it was, frankly, it was over-needed. It was overdue for a wide range of reasons, which we can get into later, but just the basic level of transparency, accountability, support for our military families was not where it needed to be. And so the complaints that you were seeing in social media, frankly, I thought they were quite legitimate. So we're working, so to answer your question on a business case analysis, I did see the initial draft on the business case analysis. It was submitted to Congress last week, actually, I think. It was pretty consistent with what our analysis and findings were. The numbers are really, the numbers of a typical business case analysis are really pending because you need the proposals. We have the proposals, actually. We had several very legitimate proposals come in against the RFP, and they are within the band of cost of the program today. So although the BCA that LMI didn't have access to that, we do have it. It's obviously procurement sensitive. But what I would tell you is the proposal that exists today and what's been narrowed down to multiple proposals is consistent with the current program cost, and so we're in pretty good shape there. GAO is finishing up their report. That was the other prerequisite that Congress wanted to take a look at. Obviously, we've seen drafts of that. They're pretty consistent with their recommendations on what we need to improve the performance for military family members. So what we really want to do here is we need to gain accountability of industry. We need to improve responsibility in the department because it's bifurcated today. And at the end of the day, we want to create the right incentive structures so that during peak season, where most of the moves take place and capacity is depleted, where we can increase the level of capacity to support peak season moves. So that's our objective. So we intend to award in April, end of April plus maybe a little bit, and then take a full, very deliberate, lengthy transition on a very complicated transition with fully operational capability status in peak season of 21. So we're a year out from FOC, but we'll go IOC here, at the beginning of the summer. Yeah, thanks.
Go to this side right here.
Hi, Christopher Woody from Business Insider. So a more general question. Other combatant commanders have talked about, in the context of great power competition, expecting to face a fight to get to the fight. So for you at Transcom, that initial fight, what's your thinking about that? How do you expect that to challenge your operations and your assets, and what kind of thoughts do you have about mitigating those additional or new risks?
Yeah, well, we spent a lot of time thinking about this, and you know, it's a pretty complex environment. It's you know, I wouldn't say, you know, you just snap to you're in full conflict. There's a great deal of competition that exists today. How that crisis would evolve would definitely affect, you know, how we would approach that. But we're working a number of initiatives, frankly, and you know, key is the full integration of the logistics warfighting function with all the others, so you have a level of protection that you need to be able to operate. So, for example, in the Defender 20 exercise that was coming up here shortly, there's a concerted effort in that exercise to work inside the maritime component, even though it's largely a land exercise in Europe, to synchronize our efforts with 2nd Fleet and 6th Fleet to facilitate the sea lift move across the transatlantic. Those are kind of skills, is what I would say, are probably a little rusty, right? We just haven't done that in a long time. So we're integrating it into our exercises. We're getting better fidelity on how our adversary sees the mobility enterprise, and there's a full court press on in this particular area, on how we would anticipate contested environments, and what are those things that are really most consequential in a very large enterprise. It's a very large attack surface. And frankly, not all things are equally consequential. So our job really is to remediate the risk and continue to operate through what could be some pretty sporty environments.
I think we have time for one more question, you, sir.
Thank you. Hi, General. Justin Katz, Inside Defense. I wanted to ask you about sea lift in particular. There's been some reports over the past year by DODIG as well as the RAND Corporation, and the common thread seems to be that they are criticizing some of the procedures and how your command as well as the Maritime Administration are operating when it comes to sea lift readiness. You're going to be on the Hill in a few weeks asking for more money for newer ships, so I'm guessing if you could respond to some of these criticisms about how you're managing your current fleet.
Yeah, well, I'm actually not going to ask for more money for new ships. I think you know, again, back to the strategy, I frankly agree that the readiness of the fleet is not where it needs to be to support the movement of decisive force. This is an area that's not new. We've been working this with the Hill. I think what Congress has given us is at least a bridge, right, on the acquired used acquisitions that allows us to buy 7. So our intent is that, you know, by the end of this year or beginning in XFY, we're buying the first 2, and then we're going to follow it with, you know, 2 or 3 more. And what I'd like to see is more money to accelerate the used buy move ahead. I frankly think the new buy piece is going to be very, very difficult for the Navy to go after. So my own personal view is the faster we can move to demonstrate good faith in what the Congress gave us to do, the faster we can demonstrate that is a viable way to move forward in the industry and buy down the risk.
Well, thank you, General, for joining us here today, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. If you could all just please stay seated as the General moves on to his next event.
Okay.
Thank you all
Well,
very much.
thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Yeah.